The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across Fort Kingswell's firing range, filling the air with the metallic scent of gunpowder. Lieutenant Arya Dalton approached a group of male soldiers preparing for long-range target practice. Her steps were soft, barely audible until Sergeant First Class Mason Riker noticed her. His smirk appeared before his words. Calmly, Arya stated her wish to attempt the sniper qualification. A burst of careless laughter spread through the men. Riker shook his head, suggesting she stick to office duties, calling her too delicate for such work. A few corporals leaned in, whispering that she didn't even look like a marksman, their voices thick with unearned confidence. Arya showed no reaction. She stood still, letting their disrespect settle over her like dust, refusing to acknowledge their mockery. Their laughter faded down the range, thin and meaningless. Lieutenant Arya Dalton didn't look like someone who could quiet a noisy firing line. She was small, with slender shoulders and steady, observant eyes that missed nothing yet revealed little. Most days, people passing her in the Fort Kingswell hallways would offer polite nods, forgetting her moments later. Her job didn't help their assumption. Officially, she was a forward observer assigned to the battalion's fire control, the kind of officer usually dealing with maps, coordinates, and paperwork, not the grime of combat, the kick of a rifle, or scorch marks on metal. She was the one called for checking grid references, not for becoming a legend with a rifle. This reputation cloaked her like an invisible shield. Yet on training days, Arya always found herself drawn to the shooting lines a little sooner than necessary. While others joked or checked their phones, she studied every small detail of the early shots, the rifle's slight dip before the trigger released, a shooter's breathing rising too high, or how impatience made the barrel wander off target. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, observing patterns no one believed she noticed. The soldiers saw a quiet lieutenant who signed range cards and tallied ammunition without complaint. They didn't see her gaze automatically flick to the shimmering air above the ground, or how she'd check flags to confirm wind against what she felt on her skin. When a shot missed, her eyes would move almost imperceptibly, as if correcting an unseen calculation in her mind. Her reputation in the unit was simple: quiet, polite, always early. She arrived at briefings first, sat in the same seat, and left only after the last slide vanished. She didn't interrupt or speak over anyone. She listened, took notes, and then blended into the background before the coffee had cooled. For most, that was enough to form their opinion of her. Some enlisted men playfully called her the paperwork lieutenant, useful for fixing coordinate mix-ups, but not much else. They didn't say it with malice, at least not at first. It was spoken with the casual certainty of people who never question the stories they tell themselves about others. A few believed they were being kind by suggesting she stay far from any danger. Only a handful ever noticed that she almost never removed her long-sleeved shirt, even when the heat pressed heavily on the range. On her left forearm beneath the fabric, a faint shape sometimes appeared when the sun hit it just right. It could have been anything: a small drawing, a simple line of ink. But no one had ever seen the complete image. The sleeve always covered it before curiosity could truly grow. Sergeant First Class Mason Riker was Arya's exact opposite in nearly every obvious way. He had a broad chest and the confident swagger that came from many combat deployments, plus a voice that easily carried across the range without a microphone. Years of training had sharpened his self-importance as much as his shooting skill. His men respected him, but they quickly learned to laugh at his jokes if they wanted to stay on his good side. Riker prided himself on instantly recognizing a skilled shooter. He claimed he could tell by how a soldier held their weapon and carried themselves whether they'd survive a real firefight. He enjoyed pointing out range heroes who looked the part but couldn't hit a target consistently. To him, Arya was just another officer who belonged with maps, not behind a scope. Corporal Ethan Briggs, Riker's loyal follower, was the predictable comedian. He had a quick smile, ready comments, and a habit of echoing whatever punchline he thought would get the biggest reaction from the sergeant. Briggs wasn't naturally cruel, but his desire to fit in with the louder voices made him join in the teasing faster than he might have alone. It was simpler to be the echo than the target. Then there was Staff Sergeant Colton Ward, who rarely laughed when others did. Ward kept a lower profile, standing slightly apart from the group, arms crossed, his eyes narrowed against the bright light in his own thought. He had witnessed enough over the years, Dusty Valley gunfights, nights smelling of gunpowder and fear, to know that confidence and ability weren't always the same thing. When Arya stepped onto the range, he didn't smirk, he walked. Arya felt all their eyes as she moved along the gravel path toward the shooting stations, yet she kept her gaze steady and unhurried. She had learned long ago that people would fill the gaps in her silence with whatever made them comfortable. Naivete, weakness, innocence. She let them. It didn't change the truth of who she was or what her hands had experienced. In quiet moments when the range was empty and the sky above Fort Kingswell softened to shades of purple, Arya sometimes found her thoughts drifting back to places no one here had ever seen. Wide open lands where the wind howled across fields. Days in Montana when she stood beside her father on a ridge, her rifle resting on a worn pack, the world shrinking to a single breath, a single target. He had taught her early that a rifle doesn't forgive arrogance, and the wind doesn't care about rank. He had shown her how grass rippled in long invisible waves, how dust rose from a distant road before a truck appeared, how the air changed hours before a storm. Wind, terrain, patience. The same three words repeated until they stopped being lessons and became part of how she viewed the world. Those memories lived just beneath her calm expression. Here on base, no one asked about Montana, and she offered no stories. It was simpler that way. Years ago she had decided to keep parts of her past hidden, not out of shame but because she knew how quickly people could turn someone's history into a casual story they hadn't earned. There were nights, distances and choices she refused to let become cheap entertainment. That choice weighed on her more heavily than she ever admitted. Every time she watched someone struggle with a shot she knew how to fix, every time she heard someone boast about a range day that would have been a mere warm-up where she had once been, she felt the edge of that silence. It was like carrying a heavy pack that no one else could see. Still, she kept her sleeves down. She kept her voice steady. She signed the papers, checked the coordinates, and answered questions about angles and corrections as if she had learned them only from a manual. If anyone wondered why her explanations sounded like genuine experience rather than classroom drills, they never said so. Now, standing on the gravel with Riker and his men watching her like a strange exhibit, Arya felt that old decision settle in her chest again. She could walk away, keep her past safe, and let their version of her remain unchallenged. Or she could finally ask for what she knew she had already earned in places none of them had seen. She drew a slow breath, feeling the fabric against the ink on her arm, the familiar weight of everything she had done and chosen not to discuss. Her eyes met Riker's, not challenging, not begging, but steady like a marksman settling behind a scope. "Sergeant Riker," she said, her voice calm and clear in the morning air, "I request permission to attempt the sniper qualification lane." Sergeant First Class Mason Riker stepped closer, the gravel crunching under his boots as he blocked Arya's path to the shooting bench. His shadow fell across her feet, heavy and deliberate, like a warning. He looked her up and down with disbelief that edged into annoyance. Then he leaned in, his voice low enough to feel personal but loud enough for his audience. He told her sniper work was for real fighters, not for paperwork officers. His words landed as if he expected them to shut her down completely. Around them soldiers drifted nearer, drawn by the tension like moths to a flame. They formed a semicircle, arms crossed, heads tilted, smirks spreading from one face to another, as if Riker's disrespect had given them all permission to treat her as a joke. Corporal Ethan Briggs faked a deep breath, puffing out his chest and whispering, "Steady breathing," in a mocking, meditative voice. The laughter that followed was sharp, quick and eager, as if everyone wanted to prove they were in on the joke. Arya didn't flinch. She didn't step back or let her shoulders slump. She stood with her hands folded neatly behind her back, her posture straight, her eyes calm. The morning sun warmed her uniform, but the space between her and the crowd felt cold, thick with the weight of unspoken judgment. She looked like someone choosing self-control over reaction, silence over foolishness. Riker seemed certain she would lower her gaze and turn away. He barked an order for her to leave the range immediately, telling her that wasting the instructor's time was the quickest way to make enemies in the His tone softened just enough to hide the condescending edge behind it. Arya didn't move. She stood so still that a few soldiers shifted their weight, now unsure who was truly in control of the moment. Riker's jaw tightened, annoyance beginning to show. When she didn't back down, he took half a step closer, trying to reclaim the authority he felt slipping away. More soldiers from the infantry section wandered over, helmets in hand, Drawn the raised voices. They gathered behind the first group, forming a second ring of curious, eager watchers. Someone whispered that she had never shot beyond 300 yards. Another soldier beside him mumbled that he'd bet a week's pay she wouldn't even touch the rifle. The comments floated through the group like drifting smoke, carried by people who had already judged her without knowing a single truth about her. Arya let their whispers wash over her without a response. She kept her eyes on Riker, calm and unblinking. She waited until the murmurs faded, until the entire crowd watched her like an event waiting to unfold. Only then did she speak. "Just give me one lane." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise with a clarity that brought silence in its wake. Riker stared at her for a moment, then another, before the laughter came. Loud, dismissive, almost desperate. He laughed directly in her face, not because it was funny, but because he needed everyone to know the joke was still under his command. Yet, something shifted around them. Not everyone joined the laughter this time. A few faces in the crowd turned uneasy. One infantryman lowered his arms, frowning. Another pressed his lips together as if the joke had suddenly lost its sting. Ward, standing slightly behind the others, watched the exchange with a tightening jaw, his gaze fixed not on Riker but on Arya. She didn't react to the taunting. Instead, she stepped past Riker, her boots crunching on the gravel with quiet determination. She moved toward the shooting bench with a deliberate calm, the crowd parting just enough for her to pass. The rifle lay across the wood, matte black metal catching the thin morning sunlight, its scope glinting softly. She placed her hand gently on the stock, the gesture almost respectful. That single touch was enough to send a ripple through the watching crowd. Briggs's grin faltered. A couple of soldiers exchanged confused glances. Ward's eyes narrowed with recognition. Something about the way she handled the rifle wasn't the hesitant movement of a beginner trying her luck. It was something else. Something learned. Riker reacted quickly, his hand shooting forward to stop her before the moment slipped from his grasp. His fingers hovered inches from her wrist, the crowd holding its breath, unsure of what was about to happen. The air around them grew tense. It felt as if the entire range drew one collective inhale and forgot to exhale. The breeze that had been carrying their mockery moments earlier now seemed to pause, as if the wind itself was waiting. All eyes locked on the two of them. Arya stood steady, Riker reaching, the rifle between them like a thin line dividing the person they assumed she was from the person she might truly be. And for the first time that morning, not a single soldier laughed. As Arya adjusted her grip on the rifle, shifting her sleeve just enough to free her wrist, a thin strip of ink flashed beneath the fabric. It was only a glimpse, half a circle of crosshairs, a sliver of numbers arranged in a way no decorative tattoo ever would be. But it was enough to catch Staff Sergeant Colton Ward's eye. His expression changed instantly, the faint frown lines around his mouth tightening as something old and half-forgotten stirred in his gaze. He had seen marks like that before, usually etched into the skin of people who had spent long nights in dangerous valleys, people who had fired shots that couldn't be talked about casually. Riker didn't notice or didn't care. He kept his voice sharp, still riding the momentum of his teasing, still trying to force the moment back under his control. He waved her off with the same dismissive confidence he'd had from the start, unaware that the mood around him had already begun to shift. The laughter was gone. The men now watched with an uneasy quiet. Arya lifted the rifle as if it were an extension of her hands, not unfamiliar. Her stance settled naturally, shoulders dropping, elbows forming a stable triangle, weight adjusted so subtly it looked effortless. Beginners fidgeted, beginners hesitated. Arya moved like she was tapping into muscle memory she'd stored long before Fort Kingswell even knew her name. Her breathing slowed in a way that felt deliberate and practiced. Her chest rose and fell with the rhythm of someone who understood that a shot began long before a trigger was touched. The wind shifted across the range, carrying with it the sharp smell of dust and gunpowder. Arya closed her eyes, but only for half a second. It was too quick to be nerves and too purposeful to be hesitation. Ward recognized the motion instantly. It was the quiet ritual of experienced long-range shooters, reading the air through instinct rather than instrument. A small exhale left her lips as if confirming a calculation no one else could see. Another detail emerged. A faint, pale scar just above her wrist. Clean cut, surgical. The kind of mark that came from an injury treated far from comfortable hospitals. On nights when decisions had to be made quickly. Ward saw that too. He took a slow breath, arms folded, no longer pretending to be uninterested. A captain walking past slowed his stride, his eyes falling to Arya's posture. Something about the way she braced the rifle made him stop completely. He wasn't close enough to hear what was being said, but recognition flickered across his face anyway. Recognition mixed with something like surprise. He lingered just long enough to make the watching soldiers exchange questioning looks, then resumed walking, though his head turned back once more before he disappeared behind the control shack. Whispers began to spread through the crowd like thin cracks in a wall. Where did she learn that grit? I've only seen shooters do that after deployment. That's not beginner stuff. One infantryman leaned sideways to get a better look, his eyebrows furrowing as he studied her hands, the rifle's angle, the way she tucked her chin without thinking. Another mumbled that she looked too calm for someone who's never done this. The words hanging in the air with a weight that trembled between doubt and respect. Arya didn't seem to hear any of it. Or perhaps she heard every word and simply refused to let any of it matter. Her eyes remained on the lane, scanning distance markers, terrain dips, the faint shimmer above the ground, signs only an experienced shooter would read this way. She moved 1 foot a fraction of an inch backward, settling her weight just a bit lower, adjusting the angle of her stance without making a sound. Riker finally noticed the shift in the energy around him. The smirks were no longer aimed at Arya. They were fading, replaced by something more uncertain. He straightened, clearing his throat as if to bring the moment back under his command. Then he jabbed a finger at the lane with exaggerated impatience. Enough theatrics, Lieutenant, he snapped. Get it over with. His voice echoed across the range, sharp and brittle. The order was meant to be final, meant to re-establish his authority, meant to stop the murmuring that made him uncomfortable. But the command only deepened the silence. Arya lowered herself behind the rifle with steady, practiced ease. No rush, no tremor, no sign of a woman out of her depth. Ward's jaw flexed. Briggs swallowed, his grin now hollow. A couple of soldiers took involuntary steps closer, not out of confidence, but out of a curiosity that bordered on tension. The air stretched thin, the wind holding its breath again. And for the first time it was not Arya who looked out of place. It was everyone else. Arya lowered herself behind the rifle with a calmness that made the gravel shift softly beneath her boots. She settled into the prone shooting mat without haste. Her movements were smooth, efficient and composed. No wasted energy, no nervous fidgeting. Her elbows planted firmly, her spine aligned behind the barrel in a way that looked instinctual rather than taut. She made micro-adjustments so subtle most eyes wouldn't have caught them. Rotating her shoulder a few degrees, shifting her cheek against the stock until the scope's edge formed a perfect ring, sliding her support hand an inch forward to lock her position. These were the precise actions of someone who had done this before, not the clumsy adjustments of an officer trying something new for the first time. The men who had laughed earlier weren't laughing now. Their smirks had faded into something else. Weariness. Perhaps even reluctant interest. Arya didn't look at any of them. Her focus narrowed to the lane ahead, the silhouette target set at a challenging mid-range distance. The wind pushed lightly across the range in unpredictable gusts. Then, without lifting her eyes from the scope, she spoke. Wind read. The question silenced the last traces of laughter. Riker scoffed immediately, waving a hand as if the request were absurd. Just shoot the rifle, Lieutenant. You're not out here writing a textbook. But someone else moved before Riker could dismiss her completely. Ward stepped half a pace forward from the crowd, his arms no longer folded. His voice was even, neutral, but carried an undertone that suggested he wanted a clearer view of the truth he suspected was hiding in plain sight. 7 to 9 miles per hour, left to gusts hitting 12. Ward said. Arya gave a quiet nod. Not a thanks, not even a glance. Just a slight shift in her breathing, as if the numbers clicked into a familiar calculation inside her mind. Her finger eased toward the trigger. The shot broke cleanly. The round cracked across the range, kicking up dust around the steel plate as it struck just off center. Close, controlled, not luck. Arya didn't celebrate or react. She didn't even lift her head. She adjusted 2 clicks on the scope, shifted her right elbow, corrected her breath and fired again. This time the shot hit just a few inches from the center. The ringing sound was sharp and unmistakable. The crowd fell silent. The smirks vanished entirely. Riker's jaw tightened. Still, Arya didn't react. She examined the hit, not the a tiny shift in her cheek welled, a marginal adjustment of her body weight, a breath in and another out. Her third shot rang out, a crisp, direct hit to the center. The watching group froze, as if the entire base exhaled at once. Briggs blinked rapidly, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, his voice thinner than before. He wasn't smiling now. He was trying to convince himself the world still made sense. Riker stepped forward, his voice louder than necessary. "Try the 1,000-yard steal. Let's see if that luck holds." His order hung heavy in the air, more a challenge meant to expose her limits than a true test of skill. But Arya only rose to her feet with calm precision, brushing the dust from her palms. She showed no excitement or nerves. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had stood behind a rifle under real pressure, under conditions these men had only trained for in controlled lanes. She positioned herself at the bench again, lifting the rifle and resetting her stance. Her movements were unmistakable to Ward. He had trained alongside deployed snipers in places where the wind carried sand and fear in equal measure. He had seen the way seasoned long-range shooters read the world around them. Arya moved exactly like those men and women, with the collected stillness of someone who had learned that speed came second to correctness. She didn't ask for another wind reading this time. She closed her eyes for a breath, felt the air, studied the shimmering mirage above the barrel, and made 3 small adjustments. One to the bipod, one to the scope, one to the angle of her right foot pressing into the dirt. Then she fired. The bullet traveled the long stretch of open range, slicing through the shifting air. It struck the distant steel plate with a flat, echoing clang, a perfect hit at 1,000 yards. A collective intake of breath swept through the watching crowd, a quiet disbelief threading through their faces. Someone whispered, "No way." Another murmured. She calculated drift on her own. The shift rippled outward, doubt softening into respect, mockery dissolving into the early edges of admiration. Even the infantrymen in the back straightened a little, their brows furrowing as they replayed everything they had just seen, suddenly unsure of the assumptions they had built around her. Arya slowly rose from the rifle, her breathing controlled, her expression unchanged. She didn't look for praise or validation. She just stepped back, wiping her palms again, as if the shots were nothing more than familiar movements she'd made 100 times before. Ward didn't hide his stare now. He stepped forward, eyes locked on her sleeve, on the faint outline of a tattoo partially revealed earlier. Crosshairs, numbers, distances. He had seen tattoos like that before. Only a handful of shooters earned designs like that, and none of them had been beginner. Ward's boots shifted on the gravel as he moved closer, suspicion solidifying into certainty. There was no way this woman was who everyone assumed she was. Not anymore. Not after shots like that. Not after the way she moved, breathed, calculated. He wasn't just watching Arya Dalton now. He was witnessing the first unmistakable signs of someone who had lived a life these soldiers didn't yet understand. And the real reveal was still coming. The metal door of the range officer's hut creaked open, and a faint hush rippled through the soldiers even before anyone saw who stepped out. Boots struck the concrete with a slow, measured rhythm. Then the figure emerged into the sunlight. General Nathaniel Carradine himself, the one man on base whose presence could silence a battalion without raising his voice. Conversation died instantly, shoulders snapped upright. Even Riker's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Whatever mockery had existed only moments earlier evaporated in the general's shadow. Carradine didn't look at the crowd. His gaze was locked on Arya Dalton. He had been standing inside the office, watching the last series of shots through the narrow window, overlooking the range. Now he walked forward with deliberate calm, each step increasing the tension in the air. The men parted for him without being asked, forming a wide arc that left Arya alone on the gravel as the general closed the distance. When he stopped in front of her, his eyes didn't go to the rifle or the target downrange. They drifted to her left forearm, to the faint shape beneath the sleeve she had tugged earlier. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Lieutenant, may I see that tattoo?" Every breath around them paused. Even the wind seemed to still, as if the entire base was waiting for her answer. Arya hesitated, not out of fear but out of something closer to reluctance, like someone being asked to open a chapter she had kept closed for years. Her fingers moved slowly to her sleeve. With careful precision, she rolled the fabric upward, revealing the full ink beneath. The tattoo wasn't decorative. It wasn't pretty. It was a record. A sniper's scope etched with fine, disciplined lines. Wind notations curving around the sides. 4 numerical distances arranged with careful spacing. Ranges that weren't random, weren't artistic, weren't guesswork. They were exact. The kind of numbers that told a story only a few people in the world would recognize. Karadin froze. His breath caught, not dramatically, but with a subtle tension that spoke of memory, of recognition, of something long buried resurfacing in an instant. He knew those distances. He knew them precisely. 140 meters. 147 meters. 983 meters. A final shot at over 1,300 yards. They weren't inked for decoration. They were the exact engagement distances from a classified joint operation in northeastern Afghanistan, an operation he had personally reviewed 6 years earlier. Reports had come through, fragment by fragment, mentioning only an unregistered long-range shooter who had saved 2 teams pinned down in a valley ambush. At the time, no name had been attached. Contractors rarely received that kind of recognition. Now he was staring at the proof. His voice deepened, dropping to a low, steady register. Where did you earn those? Arya held his gaze, her expression calm, but edged with an old seriousness. When she spoke, her voice barely rose above the breeze. Afghanistan. Before I commissioned. Another silence swept the rain, this one heavier than all the mockery combined. Soldiers who had laughed minutes earlier now stood rooted in place, their faces shifting slowly from confusion to shock, then to something that felt uncomfortably close to shame. Ward exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing, not out of suspicion anymore, but out of pure realization. Riker's mouth hung open, his earlier arrogance dissolving as the truth settled like dust at his feet. No one dared speak. No one moved. Respect, genuine, startled, and earned, began to take hold, spreading across the firing line like a tide reversing direction. The woman they had dismissed was not who they thought she was. She had been someone long before Fort Kingswell ever judged her. General Karadin took one slow step back, his eyes never leaving Arya's tattooed forearm. For a long moment, he simply studied her, really studied her, like a man piecing together a story he should have recognized sooner. Then his chin dipped in a deliberate, unmistakable nod. Not a courtesy, not protocol, a gesture of respect offered from one warrior to another. That single nod hit the firing line harder than any shouted order. Sergeant First Class Riker's face drained of color, his earlier swagger collapsing as reality settled on him. His jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the cold shock of someone realizing he had crossed a line he didn't even know existed. Corporal Briggs dropped his gaze to the gravel, his shoulders shrinking. The jokes that had come so easily to him felt like poison now hanging in the air, sour and heavy. Ward, on the other hand, stood taller, his spine straightened as if something inside him clicked into place. All the tiny details he'd noticed, her stance, her breathing, her instinctive adjustments, none of them were coincidences. They were clues, and now he saw the whole picture. His eyes softened around the edges, not in pity but in a quiet kind of awe. Karadin finally turned toward the gathered soldiers. His boots shifted on the dirt, and his stare swept across the group with a weight that made even the most confident men instinctively brace themselves. You laughed, he said, his voice low but cutting through the air like a blade, at someone who saved American lives at distances most shooters only read about. A silence followed that felt absolute. No wind, no shifting boots, no murmurs, just a stillness so deep it pressed on the chest. Some of the younger soldiers looked away, their cheeks flushed. Others stared at Arya with wide, unblinking eyes, as if seeing her for the very first time. Riker's lips parted, but no words came out. Briggs swallowed hard. A few infantrymen who had drifted over to witness the mockery now stood frozen, the shame hitting them even though they hadn't said a word. Arya didn't move. She stood as quietly as she had at the start of the morning, her hands steady, her shoulders level. Her expression remained the same, calm, composed, showing no pride, no anger, no triumph, just that same quiet dignity that had carried her through the humiliation minutes earlier. General Carradine turned back to her. "Lieutenant Dalton," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "you are cleared to attempt the full sniper selection, effective immediately." The range seemed to inhale as one. A breathless moment stretched thin between all of them. It was the emotional high point, when everything shifted, when the situation rearranged itself around a new truth. The men who had mocked her now stood on the edge of something unfamiliar, respect that came unrequested, but fully earned. Arya's eyes flickered for the first time. A small, controlled breath left her chest. She didn't smile. She didn't break her composure. She simply nodded, acknowledging the order like any other. Yet the air around her felt different now, charged, humbled, transformed. Then, almost painfully aware of what he had done, Riker stepped forward. His boots moved like they were heavier than before, weighed down by pride and regret battling in his chest. He hesitated, then lifted his hand in a salute. It wavered for half a heartbeat before locking into place. Arya returned it instantly, clean and steady. No hesitation, no gloat. She didn't hold it long, didn't make a point of it. She honored the gesture, nothing more. The simplicity of her response struck harder than any dramatic speech ever could. Riker dropped his salute with a stiff nod, unable to meet her eye. Briggs shifted, his hands clenched behind his back, wishing he could disappear into the gravel. Ward stepped aside, giving her space, not out of fear but out of genuine respect. And then something remarkable happened. The crowd parted, not because anyone told them to, not because Carradine barked an order. They stepped back on their own, creating a wide open path for her, like they understood instinctively that she had earned a place none of them had the right to obstruct. Arya walked through the gap with calm, steady steps, her boots crunching on the gravel. The sun warmed her shoulders, her sleeve rolled just high enough to show the truth. She no longer felt the need to hide. She did not look back. She didn't need to. Behind her, the silence she left on the firing line was not the silence of mockery. It was the silence of deep, undeniable respect. The afternoon sun stretched low across Fort Kingswell, throwing warm light over the gravel, as Arya walked away from the firing line. Her boots moved quietly, each step measured, but lighter than before, her shoulders no longer carrying the tension of the morning. The range behind her slowly filled again with distant chatter, but none of it reached. She walked alone toward the administration building. The late-day breeze brushing against her rolled sleeve as if reminding her of what she had revealed, and why she had kept it hidden so long. She didn't regret the silence she had lived in. It wasn't born from shame. It came from the weight of nights under foreign skies, from the lives that had remained intact because a rifle had steadied in her hands when it mattered. It came from the humility her father had taught her, how certain things were meant to be carried quietly, not to. Some stories didn't belong in casual conversations. Some truths weren't meant to be traded for admiration or applause. They were meant to sit in the spaces between breaths, in the quiet moments when the world grew still. She thought of Montana, of wind rolling across empty ridges, of her father's voice guiding her through patience, through purpose. She thought of the men and women she had helped protect overseas, of the radio calls that never made it into reports, of the distances etched into her skin because she could not forget them even if she tried. People saw numbers, she saw faces, decisions that had changed the course of someone's life. Her footsteps slowed slightly as she sensed someone approaching from behind. Ward caught up to her, not rushing, not intruding. He walked beside her for a few seconds before he spoke. "I hope I see you at selection," he said quietly. "We need shooters who know what silence means." The words landed gently, without pressure, without expectation, a simple acknowledgement from someone who understood more than most. Arya turned her head just enough to meet his eye. There was no pride in her expression, no victory mixed with her gratitude, just a calm sincerity. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," she said softly. Ward offered her a small nod before peeling away, heading back toward the range, leaving her to continue her walk alone. The sun warmed the path ahead of her, the administration building doors reflecting a dull light as she approached. As she walked, a quiet truth settled in her chest, steady and clear. True strength rarely announces itself. Some warriors carry their history in silence, not for praise but because the memories demand respect. Mockery fades, skill remains. Arya reached the steps, placed her hand on the door, and pushed it open without a backward glance. The range behind her buzzed faintly, filled with shifting perspectives. But she didn't need to see it. She had already moved forward. Not every hero speaks loudly or seeks fame for their deeds. Some carry their power quietly, shaped by experiences they never discuss, choosing dignity over